In a letter written in 1955 to her friend Betty Hester, Flannery O'Connor insisted, quote, "The truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it emotionally. A higher paradox confounds emotion as well as reason, and there are long periods in the lives of all of us and of the saints when the truth as revealed by faith is hideous, emotionally disturbing, downright repulsive. Witness the dark night of the soul in individual saints. Right now, the whole world seems to be going through a dark night of the soul," close quote. And in his 1978 commencement speech at Harvard University, Soviet dissident Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn brooded, quote, "There is a disaster which has already been underway for quite some time. I am referring to the calamity of a despiritualized and irreligious human consciousness," close quote. Professor Gary Saul Morson on the hard truths offered in Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's famous 1978 Harvard commencement address, "A World Split Apart Now." My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Gary Saul Morson is the Lawrence B. Dumas Professor of the Arts and Humanities and Professor of Slavic Languages at Northwestern University. He has written or edited 21 books on Russian literature, the nature of time, the role of quotations in culture, the aphorism as a literary genre, and other topics. His most recent book, and an extraordinary one at that, is Wonder Confronts Certainty, Russian Writers on the Timeless Questions and Why Their Answers Matter. Saul, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Segment 1. Who was Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn? In the opening lines of his 1978 Harvard address, A World Split Apart, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn began with a warning. He said, quote, "Harvard's motto is Veritas. Many of you have already found out, and others will find out in the course of their lives, that truth eludes us if we do not concentrate with total attention on its pursuit. And even while it eludes us, the illusion still lingers of knowing it and leads to many misunderstandings. Also, truth is seldom pleasant. It is almost invariably bitter. There is some bitterness in my speech today too, but I want to stress that it comes not from an adversary, but from a friend," close quote. So, Saul, let's begin with that obvious question. Who was Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn?
Well, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was one of the most remarkable figures of the 20th century. He was in the tradition of the great Russian writers, but he was really inspired by the time he spent in the Soviet prison camp system, the Gulag system, for which he was arrested, when he was an army officer for writing something he shouldn't have written in a letter. And gradually, he realized that his purpose in life was to show the world what the Soviet system was like, what the Gulag was like. And when he was released, for a brief while, he was in favor with the regime because Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary of the party, was conducting a de-Stalinization campaign and allowed one remarkable story of Solzhenitsyn's to be published, named One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Ivan Denisovich is an ordinary person who had been a soldier during the war and, been, behind enemy lines, been in a German prison camp, and all those people were automatically sent to Soviet camps because anyone who'd seen the West, was done something.
Right.
So he was there, and it describes this ordinary person's feelings about, the struggle for survival and the efforts he has to build something. And, it's just an ordinary day. And it was quite shocking because nothing like that had ever been described. I remember when the book came out. I mean, it was I'm old enough to remember that when it first appeared, and it was on everybody's reading list for a brief while. And it made Solzhenitsyn world famous. But things started becoming much more restrictive, particularly after Khrushchev fell and Brezhnev took over. And so he found it impossible to publish anything else, and he was in worse and worse odor. Meanwhile, he had been writing quite a number of things which couldn't be published. Some stories, a wonderful novel called In the First Circle.
Mm.
Some of these were smuggled out and published in the West, which also did not make him any friends in Soviet Union. And it made him even more world famous. But he turned out to have been collecting material from many, many people and many sources to produce a book about the Soviet prison camp system. The book is called The Gulag Archipelago. It is one of the most remarkable books of the last 100 years. I'm sure it will be read 100 years from now and longer. It is an absolute masterpiece. You would think that, describing the 3 thick volumes, everything he had learned, mostly from testimonies of inmates who managed to survive, it might get boring, all these in pain, but it is really, this is because he's a literary genius. He's able to do that, right? And of course, he couldn't get it published in the USSR. He didn't even try, but the book was smuggled out and published in 1973. English translation 1974, so just 50 years ago. And it took the world by storm, like nothing else. I mean, as a result of this book, communism, Marxism ceased to be modish in France. That was its biggest effect. And had some effect everywhere, France in particular. And what the Soviets finally did was, he was too famous for them just to shoot him. We'll put him back in prison. So instead, one day they showed up at his house. And of course, they never tell you what they're doing. They bundle you off. They put you on a plane. And when you cross the border, they tell you that you have been stripped of your Soviet citizenship and expelled from the Soviet Union, unable to return. So he spent some time in Europe trying to figure out where he would be. He has wonderful memoirs about this, about how, people simply didn't understand what was going on. And he didn't understand a great deal about, about the West. Like, okay, in the Soviet Union, there was no law at all. But in the West, there was, everything was sort of legalism and every tiny little legal nuance. And you had to have lawyers to do everything. And people were, this was the exact opposite, right? It's from one extreme to the other. And, he thought that since, Soviet journalists always told lies, Western ones would be honest, but he discovered that was not true. Eventually, he moved to the United States. He found a place in a remote part of Vermont, which sort of reminded him about Russia, with its snow and all that, isolated, and he spent the rest of his life writing. The only breaks he took were a few times to give lectures, including this one at Harvard, which he did in 1978. He gave I don't know, 8 or 10 lectures, which have been collected in a recent book called We Have Ceased to See the Purpose. And mostly he worked on his other gigantic masterpiece. The Gulag Archipelago was 3 gigantic volumes.
Right.
This is longer, and he called it The Red Wheel. And it is several novels, historical novels, all about the Russian Revolution. What led up to the revolution? What made Russia go down that disastrous path when it could have chosen otherwise? Could have been elsewhere. And so the first one is set in 1914, and then gradually, it goes as we get closer and closer to the revolution. Like for just February 1917, I think there were 4 volumes. It was supposed to continue, but he just after April, he knew he would never finish it. So that's his other big legacy. One critic referred to his two big cathedrals, meaning Gulag and the Red Wheel.
Yeah.
But he's many other things. I really like that novel, In the First Circle. He is like every writer, he has some strengths and weaknesses, but his strengths make him, one of the truly great writers of the past 100 years.
Saul, one thing I want to ask you is, you talk about the notion of how seismic of an event it was for the Gulag Archipelago, and then the publication of the One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich would have on Soviet society, but also Western society. You think about from 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution when it occurred to 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. Would you say that for instance, the release of the Gulag Archipelago, does that rival only, say, Khrushchev's thaw speech, in 1956, kind of condemning Stalin on certain excesses and so on? Can you think of any other moments of sheer cracks in the edifice? I'm not talking about the Prague Spring and the Hungarian uprising and solidarity and so on, but I'm saying kind of within the Soviet command structure itself or Soviet society itself. Is the release of the Gulag Archipelago spirited out of the society? And is that in Khrushchev's thaw speech the two most seismic shakes of the Soviet enterprise from 17 to 91? Is that being too grandiose?
No, I think so. There are a few others, like, some other dissidents, like Andrei Sakharov. Or,
sure.
Natan Sharansky's books made big hit. But I think actually the Solzhenitsyn one was much more shocking than the Khrushchev.
Yeah.
Because the Khrushchev speech didn't really come to terms with most of Stalin's crimes.
Sure.
Focused on the fact that he arrested hundreds of thousands of innocent Communist Party members who were completely loyal, right? It didn't, for example, go into any detail about the collectivization of agriculture, which cost, maybe 20 million lives. But after all, those were just peasants. Who cares about peasants, right? It was quite limited in what it actually discussed. There was no detailed description of, the prison camp system, of the Gulag, the kind of tortures that were implied. It was shocking enough because Stalin was gone, at the time, and to criticize Stalin.
Yeah.
So it was very shocking, but it really was not revealing most of what you need to be revealed. Whereas that was done by Solzhenitsyn. And not just of his own impressions, because he collected from many, many, other people's, their testimonies. Of course, he had to keep their names secret.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary read. It's like a hammer hitting you in the head. For at least the one I've read, 650 pages, just over and over again. And you just see this. It's just from the arrest to the interrogation to the imprisonment to the mental manipulations and the rationalizations and so on. It's a shocking expose of exposés. Let me ask you this, Saul. So here we are 4 or 5 years after the release of Gulag Archipelago. Solzhenitsyn, as you said, has moved, I think, from Europe. Now he's living in Vermont in 1978. Can you say a little bit about the state of the Cold War in 1978? I understand. I think we're at a point of Carter as president and maybe a little bit of the legacy of détente from Nixon and Ford. What's the state of the Cold War as Solzhenitsyn is sort of giving this speech at Harvard? Could you say a little bit about that?
That's really interesting. Yes, we were still in the period of détente. That is, originally, under Nixon and Henry Kissinger.
Yep.
The idea that, listen, we don't have to fight so much. Let's soften the ideological battle. We'll negotiate on on arms, and if we're just nice to each other, things will work out fine. No, we won't interfere in your internal affairs. Talk about violations of human rights very rarely. And the dissidents, in the Soviet Union, of course, regarded this as something horrible. because
Yeah.
he wanted to, talk about human rights. And that is why, just a few years later, when Ronald Reagan became president, you can imagine that he felt abandoned by the Americans because of détente.
Hmm.
And then, there you had Reagan referring to the Soviet Union as what everybody knew it really was, the evil empire.
Yeah.
And then going to the Berlin Wall and saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, let people out." Right? It was absolutely thrilling. Now, in the West, of course, they don't call it an evil empire. Well, maybe they are, but it's really not polite. It's only unsophisticated people who use evil.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you might as well be in church if you're going to do that. Don't talk like that.
Yeah.
We had the Washington Post and Yale. We don't use phrases like that. Reagan was just an embarrassment. But for Soviet dissidents and other dissidents around the world, it was what gave them inspiration and hope.
Yeah. So how did Solzhenitsyn, Harvard knows what Solzhenitsyn thinks in the Gulag archipelago and his other released work and so on. How did they come to invite him to speak? Do you know the backstory on that?
No, I don't know the details of it, but it's not hard to imagine. I mean, he'd won a Nobel Prize in Literature.
Yeah.
He was, as the most famous writer in the world, sort of like the way Leo Tolstoy had been, at one time. And, he was nearby. And, this would be wonderful to do. And besides, the viewpoint that you would expect, about advanced, professors and university administrators at Harvard, they were not pro-Soviet.
Yeah.
I mean, they were not communist. So they didn't mind him criticizing that. They didn't like it either. Right? So there was no reason not to invite him until they did.
Did you get it? Now, is Solzhenitsyn in the eyes of the Soviets? Now he's living in America. Do the Soviets look at him as this existential threat he's going to be, his voice out there could shake our foundations, or is he this nuisance poet, writer who's just let him do his thing over there? Do they understand the gravity of what they were dealing with Solzhenitsyn on the outside? And did Americans look at him as just being, again, he's going to come up and give a speech, it's going to be rah rah West capitalism America and boo to the Soviet Union? Was everybody on both sides? Did everybody underestimate Solzhenitsyn?
Yeah, I think they did. I mean, the Soviets were closer because they knew the sort of things he was saying and how dangerous they were. I mean, the most dangerous would be, of course, if the Russian people themselves knew about the Soviet people.
Right.
But that was not. They could control that once he was out of the country. But yes, it was still, dangerous for them. And I mean, there wasn't anything more he could reveal that wasn't in the archipelago. So there was no more danger except people getting to know it. But Westerners, they just assumed that Solzhenitsyn was one of them. Yeah. What else could you be if you're a smart, a great writer, someone who is, against tyranny? Aren't we all against tyranny? He's just one of us, that's all. And then he turned out not to be one.
Segment 2, The Message. In his 1978 Harvard commencement address, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn declared, quote, "A loss of courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. The Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, each government, each political party, and of course in the United Nations. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling groups and the intellectual elite, causing an impression of loss of courage by the entire society. Solzhenitsyn would go on and say, quote, and decline in courage is ironically emphasized by occasional explosions of anger and inflexibility on the part of the same bureaucrats when dealing with weak governments and weak countries, not supported by anyone or with currents which cannot offer any resistance. But they get tongue-tied and paralyzed when they deal with powerful governments and threatening forces, with aggressors and international terrorists. Should one point out that from ancient times, decline in courage has been considered the beginning of the end, close quote. So, Saul, as a scholar in Russian literature and as an active mind engaged in the world scene, and as somebody who remembers when this all played out in real time, what do you remember most vividly about Solzhenitsyn's message?
Well, I remember, I was much younger then, of course, thinking, well, how can he say we don't confront tyranny? We just fought the Vietnam War, right? Maybe a few years earlier, right?
Right,
Okay,
right.
lost, but we had fought it. It wasn't, so it didn't show a lack of courage. And not long before that, of course, there had been, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Before that, the Korean War. But there was a lack of courage. But he saw something that has become more and more apparent as the years have gone by, right? I would never have expected back then that you would, see on college campuses around the country, demonstrators shouting "Death to America," like the way that the Iranian slogan, and this is, within the realm of acceptable opinion.
Yeah.
It's quite striking. Before that, I was, rather shocked that, Bernie Sanders would be so popular. After all, he was twice the candidate, a delegate, for a Marxist-Leninist party, in the presidential election. It means he's a communist.
Yeah, yeah.
And he never repudiated it. And, he had his honeymoon in the Soviet Union. Nobody does it for the weather. So I was shocked. And when I mention this to people, they say, "What are you, a red bait or something like that?"
So let me ask you this. Solzhenitsyn explored a number of themes in his speech. I want to touch on a few of them. One of them was material comfort. So George Bernanos called the meaningful but suffering life of the saint the only adventure. And Flannery O'Connor shakes her head about people's misunderstanding of the life of faith as a big electric blanket when she says, of course, it is the cross. So what happens to the soul of a nation and the soul of a person who considers material comfort and pleasure to be the highest ends?
Well, that was his point, right? I mean, if you imagine this person who has just seen the depths of evil beyond anything America can imagine, knows it's not just him, right? And then comes to America and find out that the greatest wisdom, the most sophisticated view, is that the purpose of life is individual happiness. I mean, even in 19th century Russia, that would have regarded as so shallow that you'd be embarrassed to say it, even if you thought it. And this was way before the Soviets, just too shallow to think of, right? I mean, somehow undoubtedly you would think people believed it, but no one, since so shallow you didn't say it, right?
Yeah.
Well, and then this seemed, the full effects of this take time to work themselves out, because even though people think, they all also have other values which they've been taught, right? Larger values. But as that becomes more and more the dominant value, and the other values are way beyond memory, your great-great-grandparents, well, how do you get people to risk their lives defending their country if they think that their own lives and the happiness of it is all that matters?
Yeah.
You won't do it. Let somebody else do it, right? Is what you'll say. And as he points out, and even if you're not risking your life, listen, a higher military budget, war, will lower the GDP, lower your standard of living. Do we really want that if our highest goal is individual happiness? It doesn't matter so how many advanced weapons you may have if people don't have any courage.
Yeah.
Right? And that, again, even when I was growing up, I would have, thought, well, that's kind of exaggerated rhetoric, isn't it? But it was at the time. He was looking for the future, and he was seeing a trend which nobody else saw in the United States. I certainly didn't, but which has come to be.
Yeah. So Solzhenitsyn also berates structure of positive law, of legalism. You mentioned legalism earlier. He said, a society with no other scale but the legal one is not quite worthy of man. A society which is based on the letter of the law and never reaches any higher is taking very scarce advantage of the high level of human possibilities. Whenever the tissue of life is woven of legalistic relations, there's an atmosphere of moral mediocrity paralyzing man's noblest impulses. So why does a higher criterion, Saul, for right and wrong beyond the simple law matter so much to Solzhenitsyn, and why should it matter to us?
Well, you need law or you wind up in the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah.
But if the way most moral, social problems are handled is by passing laws, and that's all there is. If, it's either a matter of the criminal law or contracts, and that expresses our view of life, then, what does law do? Law, says don't do this, do that, rewards this, punishes that. It comes if that's all it is, and your mind is, constantly working on the details of the law, your energy is, how do I avoid this tax, or how do I get around that? Right?
Yeah.
All of those things, you're not asking, and they seem important, which means real moral questions, real life purpose questions don't seem, important. They don't come up. I'm just looking at this book from about 10 years ago called Excellent Sheep.
Yeah.
American, that this what he's talking about. You're not. More of college ought to be devoted to, the questions asked in Russian literature, right? Which people are embarrassed at. I can tell you, I have a lot of students who are not embarrassed, that's the sort of thing he has in mind when you're, there's a kind of blinkers to think only in legalistic. But that doesn't mean, law is not important. It means, it's better to have extreme legalism than to have what the Soviets had.
Right.
But it's still not very good.
Yeah. Well, and so freedom has become the ultimate value. Another notion that Solzhenitsyn explores. Rights exceed duties. Individualism outpaces the common good, leading to the triumph of mediocrity and what Solzhenitsyn dubs the abyss of human decadence. So Solzhenitsyn in his speech goes on to say, such a tilt of freedom in the direction of evil has come about gradually, but it was evidently born primarily out of a humanistic and benevolent concept, according to which there is no evil inherent to human nature. The world belongs to mankind, and all the defects of life are caused by the wrong social systems, which must be corrected. So, Saul, what does unrestrained freedom do to society and the human soul? And further, kind of exploring what Solzhenitsyn is saying there, how does a worldview sensing the notion of original sin staining the human person, or kind of an innate brokenness, how does that differ from the notion that mankind is perfectible with problems that can be fixed with just the right kind of social system?
This is what he considers, the prime error, which has led to everything else.
Yeah.
And this view, you can read about it in 19th century Russian literature, the character. The idea that crime is simply the result of bad social conditions.
Yeah.
So you change the social conditions. Bad education, you re-educate people. The wrong economics, you create a socialist economic system, and then you'll do away with it. It's a benevolent view. Evil is superficial. That's all. And if you start thinking this way, you always think the best of others, and sometimes thinking the best, of communists or Nazis isn't the best way of handling it. You're inclined to think, listen, it's just a misunderstanding, you know. Let's be nice to, the Soviets, the Maoists, the Iranians. More adroit diplomacy, open ourselves up. Don't threaten them. And things, and, as Solzhenitsyn said, if only you could hear, the Soviet, their equivalent of the State Department people laughing when they read these statements, that anyone could be that naive, right? Right? They just laugh, but it doesn't feel naive, you understand? To the people who are saying it, it feels sophisticated, and that we got to fight these evil guys. That's just, that's a bar house brawl idea. We don't, sophisticated people don't think. And so, what seems naive and will produce bad results comes across as just what you should be thinking if you are, one of the elites and have a good education, right? In America and in Western Europe. But evil, will not doubt the existence of evil, radical evil, which will, can go to depths that Americans couldn't have imagined if you have experienced the Gulag, and described it, right? We take that book seriously, and people who took that book seriously wouldn't be able to think that what we call sophistication is at all sophisticated.
So so you've delved so deeply into the great Russian literature of Dostoevsky and Chekhov and Turgenev and Tolstoy and so on, and others, many others. And one of the themes that you return to again and again is the intelligentsia, who were kind of the materialist, atheistic, the kind of social engineering types and so on, that the Russian literature rebutted time and time and time again. And my question is, how does the modern intelligentsia, or how does the Harvard, and I know an intelligentsia doesn't always mean the Ivy League and all this stuff, but how do the Harvard types or the New York Times writing or the Post in 1978 when they're criticizing Solzhenitsyn's words, and we'll get into that in a minute, how do they in all of the education they've gotten, in all of the insight they apparently purport to have, how do they get it so wrong? How do they get it so fundamentally wrong in these assumptions that would make the lowest, member of the Soviet society scoff at such naivete, that the American higher ups would be so credulous over these things? What's your sense about that?
Well, let me project you into a situation. Let's say a university, a Washington Post newsroom. You want to be regarded as one of them. You don't want to be regarded as an idiot. And so you learn the things that you say and you don't say. And since the only way to do that consistently is actually to believe in it, you get yourself to believe it. Because the alternative is to be ostracized. I mean, the alternative is to be something like, I don't know, like Barry Weiss,
Yeah.
Or Jay Bhattacharya, Yes, there are good, strong, or Joshua Katz, straight people who'll do that. But very few will do that. They most want to be, accepted. They want their career depends on it, but most of all, their comfort depends on it. They want to think of themselves as one of the good people, right? And so they get themselves to think it. And you can get people to think anything that way. So, literally, think of the worst thing in the world that you could think of. Justifying the worst things in the world. if that is what, Harvard and the New York Times editorial room and so forth are thinking, and you want to be them, you will get yourself to think, except in the first place. That's how it happens. And there's no limit to how awful it can be. Much worse, than what Solzhenitsyn was talking about.
It's amazing when you say that, because it makes me think of a elementary school lunchroom. I mean, to think about the notion of wanting to sit at the cool kids table, and you're like, you got to be kidding me. We have people that have spent, nowadays hundreds of thousands of dollars on elite educations. They're working in sophisticated workplaces. They're going to the inn parties and talking with sages of the age.
Those are the cool kids.
They're the cool kids, and being a cool kid, you like you said, you bend your. So, do you think this is sort of willful ignorance, or do you feel like I mean, is it cynical? Is it like, well, it's not that way, but this is the way I get my paycheck, or is it sort of like, no, these are people that hear one line and have decided to actively not explore the other line, and therefore they become one of them?
Yeah, no, it's not cynical at all. I mean, you couldn't do it very well if it was cynical.
Right? Yeah, good one.
It would betray itself, right? You'd seek out other cynical people to laugh, and that would give yourself away. It's not. You have to get yourself really to believe. This is, by the way, just what people like Czeslaw Milosz describes in the book Captive Mind, where you get yourself to believe, the official communist song, right? But there it's the government fostering it. Here it's not, right? I mean, it will be, I suppose, if enough people try to get it to do it. But so far, it's just the social elite, right? And that's quite powerful enough.
That's amazing. I think it was either Pagoy or Milosz that said something like, a word of truth in a conspiring room sounds like a pistol shot. That when someone's in the New York Times office and they say, well, Trump had a point on this, or whatever case you want to make, it's like, the record's scratched. No one, you've just crossed this line by saying this. So it's an amazing groupthink that you'd think, my gosh, everybody's read George Orwell. Everybody, the archives are out. The Gulag Archipelago made its way out. You should know better than this, but it seems striking how generation after generation people fall sway to being at the cool kids table.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, mentioning Orwell was almost the model person who didn't want to be with the cool kids, who wanted the truth.
Yeah.
And, all was writing about that, not just 1984. But it's increasingly becoming the case, not yet, but that if you really sophisticate these institutions, you don't talk about Orwell.
Yeah. So Solzhenitsyn spared no criticism of the free press. And though it wasn't absolutely controlled in the sense of the Soviet press, it was dangerous in its supreme and unchecked power. This is the Western press, he was saying. The Western press was dangerous in its supreme and unchecked power, its decadence, bias, sloppiness, superficiality, and its tendency towards disinformation. And this is in 1978. How much do Solzhenitsyn's criticisms of the 1978 press apply to the press today?
Well, I think there's one reason why it's accelerated, and that is, okay, if you go back to 1978, there were 3 TV channels. They all had the evening news, and people watched all 3. And they tried to at least come off as nonpartisan.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that you would not, give, even if you took one point, you would present the other one, right? Walter Cronkite, for example. People didn't know what his politics were until he retired.
Yeah.
And even, partisan news magazines, Newsweek, Time was sent one way or the other. They still were like that, right? There was no way you could escape knowing how people other than you thought. There's no way you could think that anybody who disagrees with me is simply, evil or stupid. They're mistaken, maybe, but they don't understand certain things that we do, but they're not evil or stupid. Now, quite the opposite is the case. You're taught in, journalism school and in these newsrooms that you must always stick to the narrative, and if anything contradicts it, you don't report it.
Mm.
And this is regarded as the highest idealism, because your highest loyalty is to social justice, not the truth.
Yeah.
And that's the switch. The main switch has been from, in education and journalism, from truth above all. Yes, of course, social justice too, but truth above all. We don't lie for social justice. The social justice is everything, and the truth only insofar as it supports that. That's been the biggest change, and it's considered much more idealistic. After all, there's no truth anyway, so the sort of argument.
Yeah.
And once you do that, you can justify anything, literally anything.
Christine Rosen, I think it was in Commentary Magazine. This might have been around the time that Barry Weiss wrote her open letter and left. But she talked about somebody at the New York Times, kind of the editorial, one of the leaders, making mention that objectivism is a tired, old standard and it's run its course effectively and it has no place. And now we have to write from a point of moral clarity. And what that doesn't mean, fairness doesn't mean objective. It doesn't even necessarily mean truth. It's moral clarity according to my definition of moral clarity, which, like you said, now you've got a spinning compass in terms of, a criterion for truth is sort of
both the Nazis and the Soviets could have used the language of moral clarity, right?
Yeah.
Moral clarity, right? What it leads to. I mean,
yeah.
And it doesn't take a long time. It leads to it very quickly.
So Solzhenitsyn said through intense suffering, our Russian country has now achieved a spiritual development of such intensity that the Western system in its present state of spiritual exhaustion does not look attractive. So, Saul, what does suffering do, in your estimation, to spiritual vigor? And how does decadence contribute to spiritual flabbiness?
Well, if you've been through the sort of things that Solzhenitsyn describes, the idea of all of life is about happiness and let's look for the next pleasure just seems, it's shattered. It's just ridiculous in conditions like that. It requires soft conditions to think that way. On the other hand, if you're in content, soft conditions where there aren't any significant suffering, where you call suffering something that would be a joke in a place that really has it, well, then you're not called upon to think in terms of larger purposes, right? You laugh at them. You laugh at truth. Oh, come on, there's no truth. There's only, come on, we sophisticated. We know there's just, what we want and satisfaction, and, and the higher GDP, and, that's all, and are getting it. We know that's it. Anybody else is sort of, what should we say? Well, the author Schlesinger, who is the great historian of the time, preeminent one, called Solzhenitsyn a Puritan, and today you would, you could do the same, it's sort of like those, what do you say, those naive Bible thumping, anti-evolutionist people who believe in good. That's how you characterize, right?
Yeah.
You want to be one of them, that or you have the attitudes I heard one of my colleagues express once. Any fool, he said, can defend his own country. That's basically what any fool would do.
Mm-hmm.
But we educated people must always find a way to take the other side. That's what our job is. So you always criticize it. Jeez. This was, by the way, a very eminent and first-rate historian who said this. I mean, I read his works with great pleasure. This is what he thought.
Wow. We touched on this before, Saul. I want to ask you about if you have any other words on this, the Western propensity for self-deception and rationalization. So Solzhenitsyn lambasted those who professed infinitely humane sentiments and yet whose preferred policies contributed to the enslavement, torture, and death of millions. And speaking of the rationalization of imposed communism in Eastern Europe, Solzhenitsyn said, do those convinced pacifists hear the moans coming from there? Do they understand their responsibility today? And so I would add, voices like Robert Conquest and Malcolm Muggeridge and Václav Havel were apoplectic at the self-delusion of Western fellow travelers. So in your essay, Solzhenitsyn at Harvard, which is in the coming Evangelization Culture journal for this autumn, you asked, quote, had the civilization that had been led by Churchill, de Gaulle, and Truman only 3 decades before Solzhenitsyn's speech turned into a land of what Lenin famously called useful idiots? So what's the answer, Saul? In our self-deception on the nature of evil, have we in the West in 1978, much less in the current era, have we become useful idiots to these abhorrent ideologies? Yeah.
I sometimes think that it's like Tolstoy uses this image at one point to talk about self-deception. The children's game, which goes, getting warmer.
Yeah.
Warmer. Okay. When it starts getting certain degree warmer. Not when you've got there. Getting there would be knowing something you don't want to know. When it starts getting warmer, you know to swerve off. Go into the air conditioning room. So you don't actually get there. You have this warmth. So you can always say to yourself, you didn't know. You prevent yourself from knowing, right? I think that's pretty much how it works. There are warning bells that go off, right? And you're taught to recognize those bells, right?
Wow. That's unbelievable. I mean, that it's so scary to think about someone almost being trained and adopting a posture so as to run away from the truth and not towards it. It's
not truth, but moral clarity.
Yeah, boy. One last question in this segment. Solzhenitsyn closes his speech warning that, quote, we have lost the concept of a supreme, complete entity which used to restrain our passions and our irresponsibility. We have placed too much hope in political and social reforms, only to find out that they were being deprived of our most precious possession, our spiritual life. In the East, it is destroyed by the dealings and machinations of the ruling party. In the West, commercial interests tend to suffocate it. This is the real crisis, close quote. Actually, Solzhenitsyn would continue, man's task on earth has to be the fulfillment of a permanent, earnest duty so that one's life journey may become an experience of moral growth so that one may leave a better human being than one started it. Saul, where would Solzhenitsyn have a start? What's the way in 1978? What was the way out of this conundrum to your understanding of Solzhenitsyn's perspective?
It has to be, a complete revaluation of values, to use Nietzsche's phrase, right? You'd have to, education would have to cease to be about simply making you professionally successful. It should also be about, this is the time in your life when you can ask questions. That's right. You ask big questions. There's a new movement with that title, Ask Big Questions.
Yeah.
You have to have a sense, and this has to be part of the culture, that you must have a higher purpose for life to be worth living. That stuffing your face isn't living. And what can do that? Well, in Russia, where the greatest thing in the world is literature, you can hope for literature to do that. In America, I don't know. If Hollywood would change, maybe, we would do that. I mean, indeed, occasionally you do get films like that, but they're always in fantastic mode, like Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
It clearly is about, something higher, right?
Right.
It makes no sense. But, that's elves and orcs, things like that. Right?
Yeah.
If that were to change, maybe it would change, mass entertainment. If some courageous journalism schools would start. But it pervades a great deal. And anyone who tried that would have a really rough time doing it. People are trying. Think of, some of the various sites on Substack. Not all of them, of course, but some of them are there. They're not just about, politics. If that's all it is, it doesn't work. It has to be the value. Politics doesn't work unless the value. That's what they're appealing to. So it's more about cultural things that they want to change thinking differently.
I'm one of the few. Well, I shouldn't say one of the few. I'm one of the few non-students who's had the pleasure to come down to Northwestern and sit in your class as you're teaching on the brothers Karamazov. For those who are unfamiliar, Saul is legendary in his not only his understanding and his distillation of the Russian greats, like again Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and others, but also the vivid enactment of some of the pivotal dialogues in class and so on. And to my way of thinking, and wonder confronts certainty, which I want to do a full podcast on that magnum opus of yours. I'm sure you'll have even further magnum opus in the future, but it's a tremendous, tremendous work. But you really keenly put your finger on the notion that the Russian literary greats, these questions of purpose and meaning and transcendence, they suffuse the entire reason for being of those stories. So would you say just a word or two about what Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Turgenev and Chekhov and others of the Russian literary tradition, what they can do to help fill the void of purpose and meaning, revaluing of values in the world that Solzhenitsyn is creating, is criticizing?
One of the things I mentioned in that book is a wonderful essay by Virginia Woolf, The Russian Point of View, about why Russian literature took Western countries by storm. They encountered in it something they'd never seen. It's all about soul, pure soul, and it's, the intense things that it can feel, the meanings that it seeks. The soul is the hero, of all soul in that sense, right? Finding your ultimate self, right? That's what these books are about. And asking ultimate question is what you do. It's it's not something to be, oh yeah, just a bullshit session, as we say. No, it is the most important thing. So, great literature can do that if you allow it. That's why I think it's so tragic that so many of our literature departments don't actually teach literature.
Yeah.
Either they just teach political theory, or they teach literature, not necessarily great literature, as from that perspective. You really have to look. So one of my recent students who wanted to go to graduate school to study English literature, and discovered that there really weren't any places where most of what you studied was really English literature. That's what you studied. She loved George Eliot, right? You just didn't do that. Now you can still do it in Russian departments, but then you have to know Russian.
Yeah.
But that's takes away that whole purpose of great literature, is to live in great moral questions. Greek tragedy, Shakespeare, Milton. They're asking in different ways. They're giving different answers. Great literature over the millennia and across different cultures, from the Far East to the Far West, are engaged in one giant symposium. Meaning of life.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, The Legacy of Solzhenitsyn's Speech. In his essay, Solzhenitsyn at Harvard, Gary Saul Morson concludes, quote, "In words that seem all the more pertinent now, Solzhenitsyn warned, 'The forces of evil have begun their offensive. They may well bury Western civilization forever,'" close quote. Professor Morson then asks, can a culture that does not appreciate evil resist it? So, Saul, I want to start with a question about not just Solzhenitsyn, but other dissidents. How important is the role of dissidents like Solzhenitsyn, Havel, Leszek Kolakowski, and saints like Maximilian Kolbe, Edith Stein, John Paul II? How important are they in challenging us to think clearly about the threats to the dignity of man?
I mean, they are absolutely crucial to the world today, because they clearly are not unsophisticated. Right?
Yeah.
They are not someone who can be written off as, uncultured bores. Right? They have shown courage that the people who might want to reject them couldn't imagine. Right? So they stand as moral beacons that cannot be completely ignored, although you try. Right? I would say that, in addition to Russian literature, the great gift of Russian culture in the last, let's say, 50 years has been the tradition of the dissidents. The courage that they have shown. I mean, a lot of them die under torture, as you know, right? There's Americans have forgotten the practice of imprisoning dissidents in psychiatric institutions.
Yeah.
Well, if you disagree with the regime, you must be crazy. And the diagnosis is, the typical one was sluggish schizophrenia, they call it, or delusions of grandeur. And, I can't remember, one of my recent essays, I quote something from a recent book on the dissidents about a person who, for 6 months, was subject to insulin injection treatment and other in order to cure his belief in God.
Jeez.
Okay? Now, you have to be crazy to believe we're materialists here, right? And people stood up for that. If you read, Nathan Sharansky, not just, his wonderful book, Fear and Evil, but he recently has an autobiography just out called Never Alone. And the first part of it is just about his experience, in the Soviet Union. He's isolated in prison for 11 years. No communication with his wife, with anyone, right? And he talks about how he maintains the courage not to give in.
Wow.
Assures himself that he is not alone. In his case, that there are, people supporting the Jewish refuseniks around the world. Although, of course, he was also part of the general human rights movement. His mentor was Andrei Sakharov. And so there were human rights activists around the world who were that they were supporting. Right? And he was right in that case, right? And that's, a lot of these incredible memoirs of Vladimir Bukovsky. There's just one after another of these, testimonies to strength courage of a sort we never see. I'm moved to recall a recent story, when Navalny, having been poisoned, it was horrible poison, somehow manages, it misfired, so he wound up in a German hospital.
Yeah.
He recovered, and what did he do? After recovering, he went back, and of course he was arrested and eventually died. And when he went back, a European journalist asked Natan Sharansky, why did he go back? Didn't he know what would happen to him? Is he that naive? And Sharansky replies that, I'm afraid I was rather rude in my answer. And I said to her, if your only goal is survival, you are right. It was naive to go back. But don't you understand that wasn't his goal? His goal was the salvation of his people. And he wanted to say to them, I'm not afraid. You don't be afraid either. I mean, that's what, that's what that tradition of Russian dissidents is. Of course, it's not only Russian, of course, as you mentioned, there were some in Poland, some in the Czech Republic, some all over Eastern Europe. But the core of it, of course, was, Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn and, Yevgeny Ginsburg and, one after another, incredibly brave men and women, from Russia. A tradition that begins in the 1960s, really.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible. I came obviously later to this than obviously you did, but to read the writings of Sharansky, a Havel, a Solzhenitsyn, I say a John Paul II, who was formed in the crucible of Nazified Poland and then communist dominated Poland. There is in that crucible, there's a purification of truth. There seems to be, among the strongest and most courageous individuals, the ability to dismiss the irrelevance and the distraction, and to focus purely on the notion of the nature of man and the transcendence of God and the enduring verities that are being crushed in the vice of an ideological, materialist, atheistic, totalitarian state. So it's so in a strange way, but also in a very obvious way, the suffering. It's the old canard of the diamond that gets under incredible pressure, it comes out of the coal or what have you. So it's I don't know, it's incredible, and it's my way of thinking. You have been one of the great champions of not only the verities and enduring truths of Russian literature, but also Solzhenitsyn and others that have spoken out against the modern ideological or totalitarian movements and so on. And I think those are underappreciated sources, and I appreciate you calling them out. The dissidents matter.
Yeah, I'm hoping that, in teaching great Russian novels, I will appeal to students to look at their lives more broadly. There's something, I mean, it's fine, to be oriented towards your career and your future, but also you need to recognize that can be a trivial life if you haven't thought about bigger questions, right?
Yeah.
And know how to do it. Because you also have to overcome the habit of always going along with what you're told, because that's what cool people think. You have to know how to think. So I try to model that in the classes.
Ending with a couple of two more questions. Are there any notable I don't want to, you can never, replicate a Solzhenitsyn, but are there voices today that you'd say that speak clearly, intelligently, productively, constructively, that could be a little bit Solzhenitsyn-like in our modern, increasingly ideological age? Are there any people that you read or admire their work in what they're saying today?
Well, of course, there's Natan Sharansky who's
Yeah.
still writing, right? I just read his autobiography. That's why it's so,
Yeah.
But there are, this group of courageous people, um, Dr. Bhattacharya, who's there, and there's Jonathan Haidt, there's Joshua, they stand for different things, but they all stand for Barry Weiss, for moral courage,
Mm-hmm.
and questioning. Right?
Yeah.
And of course, when people are questioners, they're not all going to agree with each other, but that's the point. That's good.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. Do you know who comes to mind for you?
Well, you do. No, I mean that's not flattery, but I'm just saying you're a foremost, and the greatest thing about it is you utilize the great lessons of timeless Russian literature to shine a bright light on the brokenness and the glory of what it means to be human, and simultaneously the best laid plans that are led astray when it comes to utopian thinking, and like you've described in the Possessed and Ivan Karamazov and so on. So I just think you have simultaneously introduced to a generation of students simultaneously the beauty and the pleasure of enjoying great Russian literature, and simultaneously the profoundly relevant philosophical insights that comes from these works that are relevant for navigating our way in the minefield of an ideological age today. And I think there are a few people on the scene that write as well as you do and teach as well as you do on matters that are as important as what you're teaching. So I'm going to leave that right there in front of you, and you can't say anything because I'm the host of the show. So that's all. No, but you really deserve those accolades. And I commend so many people to read. Everybody should read your work. Read it in Evangelization Culture, this coming issue, or this current issue, Solzhenitsyn at Harvard. But also be sure to read Gary Saul Morson's Wonder Confronts Certainty. I want to ask one last question, Saul, of you, and that is, looking back, how were you personally changed with the Solzhenitsyn speech? How were you changed at the time? How have you been changed by the example of a person who could condemn what he went through in the Soviet Union, but could come back with clarity and say, there's some things over here that we need to be careful of too. How are you impacted? How are you changed? What lessons do you derive from that speech?
Well, it's not so much that speech as his example.
Mm.
The example of, Bukowski and Sharansky, and then I remember Havel in Czechoslovakia. For me, what they meant, whenever I was wondering about, well, should I risk, saying this sort of thing, the thought that would always occur to me would be, look what, Solzhenitsyn and Havel risked. What am I risking? How can I not do this? So for me, that was, their importance, right? And I think that movement of the moral stature and courage of these people, that's, an icon for our time.
Wonderful. Gary Saul Morson, professor, writer, and modern voice of reason in an often ideological age. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.
So I've been thinking, it was in 2002, during my second year of my internal medicine residency, that I first came across Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's Harvard commencement address. It came from a dear friend and mentor, Dr. Michael Cummings, who, as my attending physician, happened upon a conversation I was having with other residents about a book called Fast Food Nation. Realizing that an inquisitive sort like myself was wasting time on a vapid, muckraker book of the month, Mike instructively placed Solzhenitsyn's speech in my hands. And I've been different ever since. Let me explain. Up to that point in my life, other than seeing a 1974 gray HarperCollins edition of the Gulag Archipelago in my father's library, I had no idea who Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was or why he mattered. Even more, I was intrigued as to why my attending physician would direct me away from the topic du jour and toward a 24-year-old speech from an impossibly old-looking Russian dissident. And so I read the speech, and I was thunderstruck. For a Russian who endured years of horrors in the Soviet prison system, who penned an intricate bombshell tell-all memoir spirited out through the underground in 1974, and who shocked the world with his revelations, it is not surprising that Solzhenitsyn would have myriad criticisms of the communist state. After all, this man was exiled from the Soviet Union and took residence first in Western Europe and ultimately in the United States. To have Solzhenitsyn speak at Harvard should have been nothing less than a pleasing victory lap for democracy and the West. But that isn't how it unfolded. While Solzhenitsyn spared no condemnation of the Soviet system that sought to crush him, he also, to the dismay of many listeners, withheld no criticism of the West. To be sure, Western democracies righteously denunciated the brutal ideology and practice of the Soviet evil empire, and their own and allied countries continued to champion a system of freedoms, checks, and balances to resist devolution to a dark police state. But Solzhenitsyn wasn't satisfied. Furthermore, he wanted to preemptively assure his audience that his critique comes not as an adversary, but as a friend. The West, Solzhenitsyn said to my ever-widening eyes, had grown arrogant, decadent, and godless. With a penchant for hyper-legalism and rights obsession, and with a paucity of truth-tellers, the West had lost its soul. And in losing its soul, its citizens risked losing their own eternal reward, while Western societies teetered precariously on the verge of moral collapse. What becomes of freedom, he seemed to ask, when its champions are slaves to their pleasures? What becomes of duty when its defenders are bloated with selfishness? What becomes of virtue if God, virtue's source, is dead? Edmund Burke, in his 1770 treatise, Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents, warned, quote, "When bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle," close quote. How do the good associate when they are atomized in their bickering, superficial self-satisfaction? How in times of great moral trial do the mediocre conceivably become mighty? In response to his speech, Solzhenitsyn was ravaged by a haughty, sniffing media elite. Deemed ungrateful, retrograde, and parochial, he was brushed aside as another crank, a Cassandra with a backward vision and an unenlightened agenda to push. While still a powerful voice among the oppressed, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was marginalized by the West's best and brightest, the very people, one may add, who had fostered the moral and cultural crisis Solzhenitsyn lamented. The truth hurts. That is something my dad often told me. We may not like it, and there may be aspects with which we disagree, but in the end, there it is. And sometimes the best person to share the painful truth is a friend, because maybe, just maybe, that is when we begin to change. And one last thing. Read Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's 1978 Harvard commencement speech, but also dive into the Gulag Archipelago. To be sure, it is tough reading, but it is a vital testimony to the endurance of the human spirit amid the most inhuman circumstances. Solzhenitsyn didn't lose faith in God in the Gulag. He gained it. In this work of works, read about the dark dangers of ideology and the glory of the spirit that outshines it. For sure, you will be alarmed, but you will also be changed. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.